It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood streets. Birds chirped in the trees, and the distant hum of everyday life filled the air. Nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be happening, but the truth was far different. It was a day that would leave an indelible mark on the lives of a mother and her child, and in turn would ripple through the fabric of their community. The mother, who was in the later stages of her pregnancy, had been running errands. The weight of carrying a child, combined with the constant pressure of daily life, had left her tired but resolute. She had faced challenges before. Every black woman, especially those living in marginalized communities, faces an uphill battle against systemic oppression. But today, she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. She didn't deserve what was about to unfold. As she drove through the neighborhood, her vehicle was suddenly surrounded by the flashing lights of police cars. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't broken any laws, but she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. She pulled over to the side of the road, the sound of her tires scraping against the asphalt adding to the tension. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat behind the wheel, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. The officers approached her car, their movements sharp and decisive. From the rearview mirror, she could see that there were several of them, at least 4, maybe 5. They didn't give her a chance to collect herself, didn't allow her any space to process what was happening. One of the officers, a tall man with a scowl on his face, knocked on her window. She rolled it down slowly, her breath shallow, unsure of what to expect. "License and registration." The officer barked, his voice harsh, demanding. She could sense the hostility in his tone, as though she was already guilty of something. She reached for her purse, trying to remain calm. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew better than to argue. The air was thick with tension, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. She handed over her documents, but instead of receiving a polite acknowledgement or a simple request for more information, the officer seemed to grow even more agitated. "What's wrong with you?" the officer demanded, his tone mocking. "You don't know how to drive properly." She felt the heat rising in her chest, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She had seen this behavior before. It wasn't just about the traffic stop. It was about power. The officers weren't concerned with her safety or well-being. They were more interested in asserting control. They didn't care that she was a woman or that she was pregnant. She was just another black person to be subjugated, another face to be dehumanized. Her hand tightened around her belly, a wave of protective instinct flooding through her. But there was another presence in the car, a presence that would change everything. In the back seat, her son, a young boy no older than 9, sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't used to seeing his mother treated this way. He had grown up learning that his mother was strong, capable, and deserving of respect. Yet here, in this moment, he saw his mother, a woman of resilience and power, being made to feel small, powerless. He could see the way the officer spoke to her, the way he ignored her humanity. His mother was being mistreated, and the injustice of it all hit him like a bolt of lightning. His young heart began to race, and a sense of righteous anger welled up inside him. He had witnessed enough of the world's cruelty to know that this was wrong. He had seen the way the police treated people, like his mother, and he knew it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern, a systemic issue that plagued their lives every day. But now, watching his mother at the mercy of these officers, he couldn't just stand by. He had to do something. He clenched his fists, his small hands trembling with a combination of fear and determination. He looked up at his mother, her face pale and drawn, her body tense. She wasn't speaking. She couldn't. She knew that saying the wrong thing could escalate the situation further. So, she remained silent, hoping that the situation would de-escalate on its own. But the officers weren't interested in resolution. They were interested in exerting their power. One of the officers, a younger man with a smug look on his face, reached into the car, his hand gripping the door handle as he yanked it open. The woman flinched, instinctively pulling away, her mind racing to protect herself and her child. But the officer was relentless. He shouted at her to get out of the car, his voice rising with each command. She hesitated, her body unwilling to comply, but the officer's words cut through the air like a knife. He was demanding, commanding, as if she was no longer a person, just an object to be controlled. Her son's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He saw the terror in his mother's eyes, the fear that she would be harmed. And it was in that moment that something inside him broke free. He couldn't allow this. He couldn't let these officers treat his mother like this. Couldn't stand idly by while injustice unfolded before him. He had to act. Without thinking, he opened the door of the car and jumped out onto the pavement. The officers immediately turned their attention to him, their faces contorting with surprise and annoyance. One of the officers raised an eyebrow, his expression mocking as he stepped toward the boy. "What's this? A little hero?" The officer sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. But the boy didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on his mother, his fists still clenched at his sides. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had seen enough. "My mom is pregnant," the boy shouted, his voice surprisingly steady. "You can't treat her like that! She's a human being!" The officers paused, momentarily stunned by the outburst. It wasn't something they had expected. It wasn't something they had ever encountered. A child standing up for his mother, for what was right. For a brief second, the officers hesitated. But that hesitation was fleeting. One of the officers, clearly irritated by the boy's defiance, stepped forward and grabbed him by the arm. The boy winced at the sudden grip, but he didn't back down. He knew that if he showed any sign of weakness, the officers would take advantage of it. His mother had taught him to be strong, to never let anyone treat him like less than he was. She had taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. "Get back in the car, kid," the officer growled, his grip tightening, "before we have a problem." But the boy didn't move. His mother, who had been silently pleading with her eyes, finally spoke, her voice shaking but resolute. "Leave him alone," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "You want to hurt him too." The officer faltered for a moment, as if the gravity of her words finally registered. He looked at the boy, his young face full of defiance and courage, and then he turned his gaze back to the mother. There was a moment of quiet, of stifled breath, before the officer released the boy's arm and stepped back. The woman, though terrified, stood her ground. She wasn't going to let them treat her son like this. Not in front of her. Not in front of anyone. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling, but she spoke with authority. "You don't have the right to treat us like this. You don't have the right to disrespect us. We are human beings, and we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." For the first time, the officers seemed to hesitate. The power dynamic that they so often relied upon had been disrupted. They were no longer in control, not in the way they had been moments before. And it was in that moment of uncertainty that something shifted in the air. The woman's voice, her son's courage, and the growing realization that their voices mattered seemed to have an impact. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring the situation to a halt. The officers, their faces hardening, began to retreat. They hadn't expected this confrontation, and it was clear that they weren't prepared to handle it. One by one, they returned to their vehicles, their hands still resting on their weapons, but their movement slower, more measured. The woman and her son stood there, watching, waiting. And as the officers drove away, leaving them behind in the dust, the woman held her son close, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew that something had changed. Her son had seen the injustice, and he had refused to let it go unchallenged. In the face of power, he had found his voice. The boy's fingers trembled as he gripped his phone. It wasn't just the weight of the device he felt in his hand. It was the weight of the moment, the weight of his mother's life, his unborn sibling's life, and the lives of so many others who had been unjustly treated. His mind raced as he stood in the street, watching the officers retreat, their sirens fading into the distance. But that wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed someone with the power to make sure this didn't happen again. Someone who could put an end to the cruelty that had just unfolded before his eyes. And that someone was the mayor. The boy didn't hesitate. He knew this was the only chance he had to make a difference, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. With a deep breath, he dialed the mayor's number. His hands shook, but his determination burned bright. The phone rang, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. His mind was a blur, his thoughts spiraling in a whirlwind of fear and frustration. What if the mayor didn't care? What if no one listened? What if nothing changed? The phone rang again, the sound echoing in his ears. Before a voice finally answered, it was the mayor. The boy's heart skipped a beat. Hello. The mayor's voice was calm but laced with the weight of authority. This is Mayor Thompson. The boy swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he couldn't afford to falter now. This was his moment to make a difference, to fight for justice, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had suffered under the unjust systems in place. He had to find the strength to speak, to tell the mayor everything that had happened. "Mr. Mayor, my name is Jamal," the boy said, his voice shaking at first, but gradually gaining confidence. "My mom is pregnant, and the police just pulled us over. They were treating her like she was nothing, yelling at her and pushing her around. She didn't do anything wrong. They were so rough with her. And I couldn't just sit there and watch. They don't care about her. They don't care that she's pregnant, that she's a person. Please, you have to help us." Jamal's words came out in a rush, the emotions that had been building inside him spilling over. The mayor listened quietly, the urgency in the boy's voice impossible to ignore. He could hear the pain and the frustration, the fear that had taken hold of Jamal's heart. The mayor's own pulse quickened as he processed the gravity of the situation. He had heard about instances of police misconduct, but hearing it from a child, hearing it from a boy who had just witnessed his mother's humiliation, this was different. This was personal. The mayor's thoughts were already in motion. He had been in politics long enough to know that these kinds of situations required more than just a statement. They required action. It wasn't just about a single case of injustice. It was about the very foundation of trust between the community and the police. It was about the kind of society they were building, one where every person, especially the most vulnerable, was treated with respect and dignity. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this, Jamal," the mayor said, his voice filled with empathy. "No one should ever have to experience what your mom did. And I promise you, I'm going to make sure something is done about this. I'm coming to you right now. Stay where you are, all right? We're going to take care of this." Jamal's heart swelled with a mix of relief and awe. He hadn't expected the mayor to react like this. Not with such immediacy, not with such genuine concern. The boy's grip on the phone tightened, his breath coming more easily now. He wasn't alone anymore. The mayor was coming. Someone who could actually make a difference was coming. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," Jamal said, his voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for listening. Please hurry. They can't keep doing this to us." The mayor's response was swift and clear. "I'm on my way, Jamal. You and your mom hang in there. We'll fix this." As the call ended, Jamal stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. The sound of his mother's soft voice, calling his name, broke through his thoughts. He turned to find her standing behind him. Her face paled, but her expression filled with concern. "Jamal, who were you talking to?" she asked, her brow furrowed. He rushed to her side, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Mum, I called the mayor. I told him everything. He's coming to help us." His mother's eyes widened in surprise, her mouth opening slightly as she processed what he had just said. She had taught Jamal to be strong, to always stand up for what was right. But she hadn't expected him to take matters into his own hands like this. In a way, she had tried to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. She hadn't wanted him to be exposed to the unfairness and the violence that sometimes lurked in the corners of their lives. But now, as she looked at him, her heart swelled with pride. He was a child, yes, but he was brave and determined, a force to be reckoned with. Before she could say anything else, the sound of sirens filled the air. Jamal's eyes snapped toward the street as a convoy of cars rounded the corner. His heart skipped a beat. It was the mayor's convoy, unmistakable with its flashing lights and the presence of city officials. The cars screeched to a halt in front of the house, and within moments, the mayor stepped out, flanked by a couple of officers and city staff members. Jamal could see the intensity in the mayor's eyes as he scanned the area, his gaze landing on the woman standing next to her son. His expression softened, and he approached them with a purposeful stride. "I'm Mayor Thompson," he said, his voice firm yet compassionate. "I'm here to help. I've been made aware of what happened here, and I want to make sure that justice is served. I'll make sure we get to the bottom of this, and that no one has to go through what you just did." Jamal's mother nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the mayor himself to show up. But here he was, standing before her, offering more than just words. He was offering his support. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the moment the officers first approached her. The mayor turned to the officers standing nearby. "You," he said, his voice sharp, "I want a full report on this incident, and I want it now. No excuses. The people of this town trust you, but trust is earned through respect, not fear. If any of you have acted outside the bounds of the law, you will be held accountable. Understand?" The officers exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them dared to challenge the mayor's authority. They stood there, silent, knowing that the eyes of the entire community were now on them. They had no choice but to comply. Jamal watched as the mayor continued to speak with the officers, his tone unwavering. It was the kind of leadership Jamal had always hoped for, the kind of leadership he dreamed of seeing in his community. A leader who didn't just talk about justice, but who took immediate action to ensure it was upheld. As the mayor addressed the crowd that had gathered, Jamal's mother held him close, her arm wrapped around him protectively. In that moment, she knew that everything had changed. Her son had shown her that the fight for justice didn't just belong to adults. It belonged to everyone, regardless of age. And together, they would stand up for what was right. The mayor's convoy screeched to a halt outside the house, and the tension in the air intensified. The weight of the situation hung heavy, a thick cloud of uncertainty and fear that clung to every corner. But as Mayor Thompson stepped out of his car and walked toward the scene, his presence immediately altered the atmosphere. The officers who had been gathered around the pregnant woman moments before, their postures stiff and defiant, suddenly seemed less certain. Their shoulders slumped imperceptibly as they recognized the gravity of the moment. The mayor was not a mere figurehead. He was a leader, someone with the power to change the course of events. His stride was purposeful and confident as he moved forward. As he approached, his gaze swept over the officers, each one sensing the change in the air. The mayor wasn't here to play politics or to minimize the situation. He was here to make a statement, to ensure that justice would be served. And his mere presence told the officers everything they needed to know. The power dynamics had shifted. For a moment, the officers seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to do. They had been rude, dismissive, and even physically rough with the pregnant woman just moments before. But now, with the mayor standing before them, it was clear that their behavior could not go unchallenged. They knew that the public eye was on them. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. The mayor was here, and the entire town would be watching how this situation unfolded. The woman and her son stood in stunned silence, watching the mayor's approach. Her heart raced, her mind reeling. She had never expected something like this. A leader, someone in power, actually showing up to stand up for her and her child. She had become so accustomed to being ignored, dismissed, and dehumanized by those who were supposed to protect her, that the idea of someone taking her side, someone with real authority, seemed almost surreal. But here he was, standing before them, unwavering in his commitment to ensure that justice would prevail. Mayor Thompson's eyes met those of the woman, and his expression softened with empathy. He knew exactly what she had endured. He had heard the frustration in Jamal's voice when the boy had called him earlier. And now, standing here, he understood the full scope of the injustice. He couldn't just talk about it. He couldn't just make empty promises. This was a moment that demanded action. Without saying a word to the officers, the mayor turned to the woman and her son. He placed a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder, offering a comforting gesture. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The mayor leaned down slightly, making sure to meet Jamal's gaze. "I'm sorry you had to experience this," Mayor Thompson said, his voice steady yet filled with conviction. "No one, especially not you or your mother, should be treated this way. I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unanswered. I'm going to make sure these officers are held accountable for their actions." Jamal nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and pride. He had never expected the mayor to show up. He had only hoped that his call would make a difference. But now, seeing the mayor stand by their side, the realization hit him they weren't alone. They weren't powerless. The mayor's words rippled through the officers, whose initial confidence began to falter. They stood at attention, their eyes darting between the mayor and the woman, now fully aware that this wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about the integrity of the entire police force and the community's trust in it. Mayor Thompson wasn't here to sweep things under the rug. He wasn't here to let the officers off easy because they wore uniforms. He was here to make sure that the truth came to light. "Officers," the mayor began, his voice calm but laced with authority, "you know the code of conduct. You know the responsibility you have to the people of this town. And what I saw today, what I've just heard from this young man, was an abuse of that responsibility." The officers shifted uncomfortably under the mayor's gaze. They had been caught in a moment of their own arrogance, and now they were confronted by someone who wasn't going to look the other way. It was one thing to treat people poorly behind closed doors, but when a public official stood before them, holding them accountable, it was clear that the game had changed. "I'm starting an immediate investigation into this incident," the mayor continued, his tone unwavering. "There will be full transparency, and anyone found guilty of misconduct will be held responsible. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated, and it will not be swept under the rug. If you believe in the oath you took to serve and protect, you should have no problem with that." The officers exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that none of them expected this. They had assumed that this would be just another minor infraction, something that could be easily dismissed or buried. But the mayor wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let anyone in the community believe that the police were above reproach. The mayor then turned his attention to the woman. He spoke to her with the kind of respect and understanding that had been sorely lacking in the way the officers had treated her. "I want you to know that you are not alone in this," Mayor Thompson said. "The actions of those officers do not reflect the values of this community. You and your son deserve better. I will make sure that your voices are heard, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that nothing like this happens again." The woman's eyes filled with tears, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. For so long, she had fought alone, trying to protect herself and her family from the systemic forces that seemed determined to keep them down. But now, here was a man who was willing to use his position to make things right. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, something that had been in short supply for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for believing us." Jamal stood beside his mother, his heart swelling with pride. He had done it. He had made the call that had set this in motion, and now he could see the tangible results of his actions. He wasn't just a passive bystander anymore. He had stepped up, and together with the mayor, they were going to make sure that the truth would come out. They were going to make sure that no one else would have to endure what his mother had gone through. As the mayor continued to address the officers, making it clear that there would be consequences for their actions, the crowd that had gathered around them grew. Word had spread quickly, and now the streets were filled with people watching as the mayor took charge of the situation. The community stood in solidarity, a collective voice rising in unison to demand justice. The mayor's resolve only strengthened as he saw the growing crowd. He knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about sending a message to everyone: when injustice happens, when people are mistreated, there will be consequences, and the community would not stand idly by. As the situation began to de-escalate, the mayor took one last look at the officers, his eyes hard and unwavering. "This is your chance to do the right thing," he said. "Don't make me regret giving you that chance." The officers didn't say a word, but their silence spoke volumes. The mayor's message had been received loud and clear. After speaking with the woman and her son one final time, Mayor Thompson turned and walked back to his convoy. As he did, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about one family. It was about the future of their community. He had set something in motion today, something that couldn't be undone. It was a turning point, a declaration that they would no longer allow injustice to reign unchecked. As the mayor's car drove away, Jamal stood with his mother, his arm wrapped around her for comfort. They were no longer alone. Someone had listened. Someone had believed them. And the battle for justice had only just begun. As the news of the incident spread across the town and beyond, it became evident that the boy's call to the mayor had ignited something much larger than anyone could have predicted. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a public outcry, drawing attention not just to one woman's mistreatment, but to a much broader and more entrenched issue: the treatment of marginalized communities by law enforcement. The anger that had simmered in the hearts of many for so long finally had a voice, and that voice was loud, insistent, and unwavering. The story of Jamal's courageous act of calling the mayor in the face of injustice was quickly picked up by local news outlets. The narrative that had initially focused on the unfair treatment of a pregnant woman shifted to become a much more significant commentary on the state of the community. Soon, the news cycle was flooded with reports, interviews, and opinion pieces discussing the broader implications of what had happened. The outrage was palpable, and the public demand for accountability was deafening. Within hours, community organizations, local activists, and leaders began organizing. They knew that if they allowed the story to fade into the background, it would be just another instance of injustice swept under the rug. They had seen it before: the momentary outrage, the promises of reform, and then, slowly, everything would go back to normal. But not this time. Not with the energy the incident had sparked. The people were not going to let this go. Local leaders called for protests and town halls. Activists reached out to organize peaceful demonstrations that would demand answers, accountability, and systemic change. They also focused on the importance of supporting Jamal's family, ensuring they were not only given justice, but also that they were not further harassed or marginalized by those who might see them as a threat to the established order. Community leaders took to social media, sharing their own experiences of systemic mistreatment and encouraging others to do the same. Hashtags supporting Jamal and his family began trending, with people from all over the country sharing their own stories of similar experiences with law enforcement. The significance of the mayor's swift and decisive action did not go unnoticed. The fact that he had taken immediate steps to investigate the incident, meet with the affected family, and show public support for accountability gave the movement credibility. It was not just the voice of a small group of activists anymore. It was the voice of an entire community, and the mayor was listening. He had set a new precedent for what it meant to lead with integrity. His actions were more than symbolic. They were a commitment to the community that he was serious about making real, lasting change. But even as the mayor stood firm in his commitment to justice, it became increasingly clear that this movement was not going to be solely about political or institutional change. It was going to be a cultural shift. The heart of this movement lay in the people's stories, the shared experiences that so many had kept hidden for far too long. And as people began to share their personal stories of police mistreatment, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated incident. For too long, people had been silenced, their grievances dismissed as exaggerated or unimportant. But now, as they came forward in support of Jamal and his mother, they began to find solidarity in one another's voices. People from all walks of life came forward to share their stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. They were not just those with a history of activism or public speaking. They were everyday people. A woman who had been stopped for a broken taillight and treated like a criminal. A young man who had been detained without cause during a routine traffic stop. An elderly man who had been shoved against a wall while trying to explain that he had lost his way in a new neighborhood. Each story was different, but they all shared one thing in common: the feeling of being diminished, disrespected, and treated unfairly by those who were supposed to protect them. These stories flooded social media platforms with hashtags like Justice for Jamal and They Stand for the Voiceless gaining momentum. More than just a hashtag, these words became a rallying cry for those who had been wronged. People who had previously felt invisible, marginalized, or powerless suddenly found their voices amplified, not only by the media but by the community around them. As the stories piled up, the narrative began to change. This was not just about one individual's mistreatment. This was about a pattern of behavior, a systemic issue that had plagued the community for far too long. People were no longer afraid to speak up. They no longer felt that their experiences were isolated. They saw the collective power in their voices. As the protests began to grow in size and intensity, the feeling of unity among the people became undeniable. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and everyone could see that they were not alone. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of possibility and hope. The marches, which started with just a handful of people, quickly grew to thousands. Some wore shirts with the phrase, "We are all Jamal," emblazoned across the front. Others carried signs reading, "Justice," not just for some, and "On police brutality." The energy was palpable, and the calls for change reverberated through the streets, amplified by the voices of those who had been so long silenced. The protests were peaceful, but their message was clear and uncompromising. This wasn't just a call for justice for Jamal and his mother. It was a demand for justice for all. People marched not only for reform within the local police department, but for broader societal change. The conversations that emerged from the protests were rooted in the need for accountability, transparency, and an end to the systemic racism that so many in the community had experienced firsthand. Despite the peaceful nature of the protests, there was pushback from some sectors of the community. There were those who believed that the protests were an overreaction, or that the situation was being blown out of proportion. There were even those who tried to discredit the movement by suggesting that the mayor's swift response was political posturing or that the incident was being misrepresented. But these voices of dissent were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming unity of the community. The sheer volume of people who came forward to speak up, combined with the visible, tangible support of local organizations and leaders, made it impossible for the detractors to silence the movement. As more stories emerged, the movement also gained national attention. Media outlets across the country began covering the protests, and prominent figures in politics and entertainment voiced their support for the cause. The narrative had shifted beyond the borders of the town. It was now a national conversation about the treatment of Black and marginalized communities by law enforcement. The media, which had once been content to report the story in passing, now had to reckon with the broader implications of the event. The attention the movement garnered led to further scrutiny of the police department, and pressure mounted on local officials to take tangible steps toward reform. The mayor, sensing the growing momentum, doubled down on his commitment to see the process through. He worked closely with community leaders and activists to draft concrete proposals for police reform, including measures for better officer training, the creation of an independent oversight committee, and a greater emphasis on community policing. He knew that the eyes of the nation were on him, and he was determined to make sure that the actions taken in the aftermath of the incident would be more than just symbolic gestures. They had to be real, sustainable changes that would shift the dynamics of the community for good. In the weeks following the protests, conversations within the community continued to evolve. There was a growing sense that the fight was far from over, but people were committed to seeing it through. Many of the activists, leaders, and organizers who had pushed for change were determined to ensure that this moment wasn't just a blip on the radar. They understood that real progress would take time, but they were willing to fight for it. Jamal, once a quiet observer in the background, found himself thrust into the spotlight. He had never imagined that one phone call could change his life, let alone the life of an entire community. But as the weeks went by, he realized that the ripple effects of his actions were far-reaching. He had sparked a movement, but it was the collective strength of his community that would carry it forward. His mother, too, began to see the profound impact of the event. What had once been a personal experience of injustice was now part of something much larger, a movement for justice that would not be ignored. As they stood together at the front lines of the ongoing protests, they understood that the power of a single voice, when joined with others, could bring about change. The town, once fractured by division and systemic injustice, was now united in a way that no one could have predicted. People from all walks of life, from different backgrounds and experiences, had found common ground in their desire for justice and equality. And it all began with one boy, one call, and a community's collective determination to stand up for what was right. The fight was far from over, but the momentum was undeniable. As Jamal and his mother looked out at the sea of faces, they knew that they had sparked something that could never be extinguished, a movement that would continue to grow until justice was finally served. The story of Jamal's call to the mayor had become more than just a single moment in time. It was a defining moment for the community, a moment that would forever change the course of their shared history. In the weeks that followed the incident, the ripple effects of that single call to the mayor began to shape the future of the town and beyond. What had seemed like a routine traffic stop had ignited a chain reaction, one that would alter the course of public conversations on police conduct, systemic inequality, and the power of standing up for what is right. The mayor, who had initially acted swiftly to intervene, understood the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about holding a few officers accountable. It was about changing the culture of law enforcement and demonstrating to the public that the voices of the oppressed could not and would not be ignored. The mayor's public meeting became a pivotal moment in the town's history. Packed with residents, activists, local organizations, and media. The meeting was a reflection of the community's collective resolve to bring about change. It was a space for people to share their experiences, express their anger, but also to push for solutions. The mayor's opening remarks were clear. This is not just about one incident. This is about making sure this never happens again. His words were not just a promise, but a commitment to the people. He would use his position of power to ensure real change. During the meeting, community members stepped forward to speak. Some shared stories of their own mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Others spoke about the ongoing systemic issues that had plagued the community for years. One by one, individuals raised their voices, amplifying the stories that had long been silenced. The room was filled with emotion, rage, sorrow, and a deep desire for change. But more than that, there was a palpable sense of unity. The collective pain of the community had been exposed, and in its place stood a resolve to fight for justice, for equality, and for a future where such incidents were no longer the norm. The mayor listened intently, never interrupting, his face a mixture of determination and empathy. He understood the stakes. This meeting wasn't just about addressing the needs of the moment. It was about setting a precedent for how law enforcement would interact with the community in the future. The days of simply covering up or ignoring instances of police misconduct were over. The mayor's commitment to reform was clear, and his actions in the following weeks reflected that. In the aftermath of the meeting, the mayor took several decisive actions. First, he ordered an independent review of the police department's practices, focusing on the use of force, racial profiling, and community relations. This review would be conducted by a third-party organization, ensuring transparency and accountability. The findings of the review were made public, and the results were as expected. The department had numerous areas in need of improvement. The review identified patterns of racial profiling and excessive force, leading to a demand for immediate action. One of the first steps taken by the mayor's office was the implementation of new training programs for all officers. These programs, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations, focused on sensitivity training, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of treating all individuals with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. Officers were required to undergo regular evaluations to ensure that they were adhering to the new standards. The programs also included a comprehensive review of implicit bias and the ways in which it can influence decision-making in high-pressure situations. These changes were not just cosmetic. They were designed to alter the very foundation of how law enforcement interacted with the community. But the mayor's commitment to change did not stop at the police department. He also established a community oversight board that would provide a platform for residents to voice their concerns and monitor police actions. This board was made up of community leaders, activists, and everyday residents, ensuring that the voices of those most affected by law enforcement practices were at the table when decisions were being made. The board had the power to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and even suggest disciplinary actions for officers who violated the new guidelines. This was a step toward creating a more accountable and transparent system of policing, one where the community had a direct hand in shaping the policies that affected their lives. As the months passed, the changes began to take root. The police department saw a gradual shift in its culture. Officers, once resistant to change, began to embrace the new training and initiatives. There was a sense of pride that developed within the department as officers took on a new responsibility to serve and protect the community with respect and fairness. The mayor continued to meet with community leaders, activists, and residents to assess progress, making sure that the momentum for change didn't fade. But the transformation was not without its challenges. As with any major reform, there were those who resisted. Some officers felt that the new training programs undermined their authority or questioned their professionalism. There were murmurs of discontent within certain corners of the community, with some residents fearing that the changes were just surface-level actions meant to placate the public. But the mayor and the community remained steadfast. They knew that real change takes time, and they were committed to seeing it through, no matter how difficult the journey. For the woman and her son, the ordeal was far from easy. Despite the positive changes happening around them, they had to endure the public scrutiny that came with their newfound visibility. Jamal, the young boy who had made the call that sparked the entire movement, was thrust into the spotlight. He had become a symbol of courage, but with that came a burden. The media attention was constant, and while many celebrated his bravery, there were others who tried to discredit him or minimize the significance of his actions. The pressure was immense for someone so young, and his family struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. Yet, they also felt an overwhelming sense of pride, knowing that their story had sparked a much-needed conversation and a movement for justice. Jamal's mother, who had been at the center of the incident, found herself conflicted. She had been traumatized by the treatment she had endured, but now she saw the powerful impact of her son's actions. She had always taught him to stand up for what was right, but never had she imagined that his words would lead to such a profound shift. She also knew that the journey ahead would not be easy for her, for Jamal, or for the community. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But the difference now was that they were no longer alone. They had the support of an entire community, and the movement they had helped to ignite was only growing stronger. The media coverage of the case continued to highlight the ripple effect of the call Jamal made. Journalists, activists, and thought leaders all pointed to the moment as a turning point, not just for the town, but for the nation. The story was a testament to the power of one individual standing up and demanding change. It was proof that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, a single voice could make a difference. The movement, which had initially focused on police accountability, began to take on a broader scope, touching on issues of racial inequality, justice reform, and the need for systemic change across the country. As more and more communities across the nation saw the results of the town's actions, they too began to demand similar reforms. Protests in other cities, inspired by Jamal's bravery, erupted across the country. Local governments, law enforcement agencies, and advocacy groups began to look more seriously at the lessons from this small town and how they could be applied elsewhere. The movement sparked by that one call had become a nationwide conversation, and it was clear that change was on the horizon. For Jamal and his family, the impact of their actions was both humbling and empowering. They had never expected their story to become a catalyst for such widespread change. But as they looked at the sea of faces at the rallies, heard the testimonies of those whose lives had been impacted by systemic injustice, and saw the tangible steps being taken toward reform, they realized that their fight had not been in vain. The lesson that Jamal had learned, and that the entire community had come to embrace, was that change starts with the courage to speak up. It starts with one person refusing to accept the status quo, one voice rising against injustice. In the case of Jamal and his mother, that voice was enough to ignite a fire that spread across the country, forcing a conversation that could no longer be ignored. In the end, the impact of that single call was far greater than anyone could have imagined. It sparked a movement that gave people the courage to speak out, to demand better, and to create a world where justice, equality, and respect were no longer just ideals, but the foundation of the community. And for the woman and her son, it was a reminder that no matter how small you may feel, your voice, when used with purpose, can indeed change the world. In the end, the story was not just about a singular act of intervention by a mayor, nor about the immediate consequences of an investigation launched by an authority figure. It was about something much deeper, something more profound. The transformative power of one phone call, one individual's refusal to remain silent, and the ripple effect that reverberated through a community, inspiring broader changes that would forever alter the landscape of justice, equality, and police accountability. The call, made by Jamal, only a young boy at the time, was far more than an act of defiance. It was a call for change, a rallying cry for fairness and respect in the face of systemic injustice. It was a reminder that the voices of the powerless, when united with courage and purpose, can topple even the strongest walls of oppression. Jamal's bravery set the wheels in motion for a series of events that would eventually transcend the boundaries of that quiet neighborhood, growing into a national conversation about the real need for reform in how law enforcement interacts with marginalized communities. Jamal had no idea when he picked up that phone that it would lead to such seismic changes. He had no idea that his words would spark a chain reaction that would reverberate across the country. But he knew one thing for certain: he could not, and would not, stand by and watch his mother, who was vulnerable and pregnant, be mistreated by those entrusted with upholding the law. His instincts, his sense of justice, and his desire to protect his mother led him to do what many would not have dared to do. With unwavering resolve, he reached out to the mayor, asking for help, calling for action. That moment, though small in the grand scheme of things, proved to be a turning point. It became the catalyst for a movement. The mayor's swift response was critical. At first, it might have seemed like a gesture of personal responsibility, a local leader responding to the cries of an individual in need. But it became something much larger. When the mayor arrived at the scene, the officers, who moments earlier had shown little regard for the woman's safety and dignity, became aware of the larger ramifications of their actions. The presence of an authoritative figure, from the highest echelons of local power, forced them to reconsider their behavior. Even in that tense and chaotic moment, it became clear that the situation was no longer one to be dealt with quietly or swept under the rug. The mayor's arrival marked the beginning of a turning tide, but it wasn't enough for him to simply acknowledge the wrongdoing. He understood the importance of addressing the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He listened to the woman's account, to the cries of her son and to the outcry from the community. But he also saw something bigger, the need for lasting, meaningful change that would protect not only this woman and her family, but also future generations who might find themselves in similarly vulnerable situations. This was not just about a public relations crisis or a single case of police misconduct. It was about rethinking how law enforcement operated and how it interacted with the communities it served. As the mayor called for an independent investigation into the incident, he also initiated a broader conversation about the culture within the local police force. He took the unprecedented step of committing to the implementation of sweeping reforms. The goal wasn't simply to punish those involved, though accountability was crucial. It was about reforming the department in a way that fostered trust, transparency, and mutual respect between law enforcement and the people they were supposed to protect. A key element of these reforms was the introduction of new training programs for police officers. These programs went beyond the usual procedural drills. They focused on humanizing the community members officers interacted with on a daily basis. The officers were required to undergo rigorous training in areas such as de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of understanding and addressing implicit biases. The mayor also took steps to ensure that these programs were designed in consultation with civil rights organizations, making sure that the voices of those who had long been marginalized were at the forefront of these reforms. But training was just the first step. The mayor understood that, for the changes to be lasting, they would have to be institutionalized. That's why he pushed for the creation of a community oversight board, an independent body composed of citizens who would monitor police conduct, investigate complaints, and have a say in the development of police policies. This oversight board was not just a symbolic gesture. It gave the community a seat at the table when it came to shaping the direction of law enforcement in the area. The idea was to create a system in which the police were held accountable not only by their superiors, but by the people they were meant to serve. For Jamal and his mother, the months following the incident were filled with mixed emotions. While they were proud of the changes that were beginning to take shape, they also knew that the road to justice was rarely smooth. As the town gained attention for the case, Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight. His bravery was celebrated, but with the newfound attention came immense pressure. Jamal, who was only a child, faced intense media scrutiny and public interest. While some hailed him as a hero, others tried to minimize his actions, casting doubt on the importance of his call. For a young boy, this attention could have been overwhelming. But Jamal found strength in knowing that he had made a real difference. His mother, too, who had been shaken by the traumatic events, slowly began to feel the sense of justice that came with seeing real change unfold. She was proud of her son, not only for his courage, but for his ability to use his voice to make a difference in the world. Though they both endured the pain of revisiting the difficult day, they were also emboldened by the knowledge that they had helped to spark a movement that went far beyond their immediate circumstances. As time passed, the impact of that single call rippled outward. What began as a local incident soon became a national story, one that captured the hearts and minds of people across the country. It wasn't just a call for justice in one small town. It was a call for justice everywhere. Across the nation, communities began to look inward, questioning how they treated their own residents, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds. Jamal's story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, one voice could create an avalanche of change. Rallies and protests across the country were sparked by the case, and communities everywhere rallied behind the message of accountability, justice, and equality. What had once been a quiet town became the center of a movement that transcended geography and race. It was clear that Jamal's call was more than just a plea for his mother's safety. It was a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or oppressed. His actions showed that people do not have to be in positions of power to make a difference. They only need to have the courage to act when it matters most. The lessons learned from the town's experience resonated far beyond local borders. It became a rallying point for police reform efforts across the nation. Lawmakers began to push for changes in policing policies, and other cities started to implement similar programs focused on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. Jamal's bravery reminded everyone that true change requires collective action and unwavering courage. It also showed that, even when the system seems stacked against you, your voice can become the force that shifts the tide. For the woman and her son, the journey they began that day, unintentionally, but with great purpose, was one that had the power to alter the trajectory of their lives. They walked away from the incident with a sense of accomplishment and pride, knowing they had played a part in creating a world where justice, fairness, and accountability could no longer be brushed aside. The impact of their story would be felt for generations, reminding future activists and everyday citizens alike that no voice is too small to make a difference. In the end, it wasn't just about the mayor showing up or the investigation being launched. It was about the power of one phone call, the courage of a young boy, and the unyielding determination of a community united in their call for justice. It was a powerful reminder that, when we stand together, when we refuse to back down in the face of injustice, we can change the world.